Welcome, everyone. I am Becky Worley. I am the technology and consumer correspondent for ABC News, Good Morning America. And we are going out on Facebook Live right now. I'm joined by Dr. Brett Finlay. He is the Peter Wall Distinguished Professor of Microbiology and Biochemistry in the Michael Smith Labs at the University of British Columbia. And by Dr. Marie Claire Arrieta. She's an assistant professor at the Cummings School of Medicine in the at the University of Calgary. And Brett and Claire and I have been working on a documentary over the last many months that will debut later this year about the microbiome. And it's based on the book that these two co-wrote together, Let Them Eat Dirt. Welcome, Claire and Brett. Thanks so much for joining me today on World Microbiome Day. Who knew this was a thing? Claire, this is a real event now, huh?
This is Happy World Microbiome Day to you. I'm delighted to be here.
I love that your background is the microbiome, some sort of microbial context to what we're talking about. Brett, why are we celebrating the microbiome? Why is it important?
Well, I think in the last decade, we have come to a major realization that all these microbes that are behind Claire's head actually impact us and affect us. And in Let Them Eat Dirt, we wrote a book about how microbes affect your child's development and how that has major impacts on us. And then we're also realizing at the other ends of life, they have a big effect too. So microbiome has been getting a lot of press lately. And so I think I love it. We got a whole day dedicated to microbes. It's perfect.
Right, it's your dream.
Oh yeah, of course.
In the context of COVID-19 and the developing research around how the microbiome plays into this pandemic, we really want to focus on that today. And as this is going out on Facebook Live today, Saturday, June 27th, we really encourage anyone who's watching to submit questions. And even if you're watching asynchronously, please post questions in the comments and we'll try and monitor that and get back to it. So I want to just start, Brett, by asking you to put the microbiome in a context of COVID-19 and how what we know about the interplay right now between this virus and how the microbiome is engaging with it in individual cases. What do we know?
Yeah, well, about 3 months ago, the world changed, and I think we all know it. And I humorously say that it's amazing a small piece of RNA, which is basically the virus, can do this or RNA can do this to the whole world. So what we are starting, we certainly don't know all the answers yet. But up until that day, we had been sort of tracking along the line, and what Let Them Eat Dirt purports is that you should really let your kids get exposed to microbes, and the threats of infectious diseases had decreased. And in our worry to get rid of infectious disease, we got rid of a lot of the good microbes. And so that was the main thesis of Let Them Eat Dirt, that you should expose your kids to these microbes. And that's all the thesis of our documentary, Let Them Eat Dirt. But then suddenly, well, in dirt and elsewhere, there's these pathogens, and we're going back 100 years ago when microbes caused all these horrible diseases that we had sort of treated. So it's a real shift. And I think the important discussion today is twofold. One, we're living in a much more hygienic world than we were 3 months ago. And two, but that has big impacts on the microbiome, and what can we do about it? And it's going to have big effects. So there's many ways the microbiome can influence us during this outbreak. And we know the microbes are really important for how your immune system develops. That helps you fight off diseases. We also know that in COVID, you get these big inflammatory responses, and that's the immune system, and the microbes might be affecting that. And for all of us living in lockdown, shall we say, our diets changed. I'm halfway through a bake every recipe in a bread book right now, and I didn't eat that much bread in my life before. And takeout's suddenly different, going to restaurants is different, our diets are different, and that, of course, is a big effect on the microbiome.
Well, but maybe, Brett, because it's sourdough, we're okay.
Well, maybe we can talk about that as we get going, for sure. And then also, I think what we're realizing is that in many other diseases, the microbiome has a big effect on whether or not or how bad you get diseases. And it's still early days with COVID, but there's some hints that maybe different microbiomes might affect the susceptibility to COVID. And then probably the other biggest thing to realize is that many of the co-risk factors associated with COVID are being driven by diseases we now know the microbes participate in. So that's asthma, that's obesity, that's diabetes, cardiovascular disease. Microbes influence all these diseases, and that then influences COVID.
Well, let's
So
break that down a little bit. So what you just said is that the microbiome impacts how we respond, who is vulnerable, and the comorbidities that are associated with the virus. So, Claire, you had published an article talking about what we know about the response. Can you talk a little bit about what we know about the response of the microbiome in regard to the way that these inflammatory cytokine storms can impact how it goes? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, sure. So on one hand, we do know that an overreactive immune system that creates a ton of inflammation is going to be really bad news for those that get infected with COVID. And that seems to be discriminating those that cannot handle the disease really well from those that can't. So we also know on the other side that our microbiome from early life on has a ton of say of how our immune system develops and how our immune system reacts to infectious diseases as well as to other diseases as well. And then there's another piece of evidence as this disease unfolds that is telling us that the microbiome signatures, if you may, of those that develop severe disease seem to be different than those that don't. So of course, not all pieces have been put together because, as Brett was saying before, this only happened, since January. We don't know this, but there's very interesting clues pointing to the fact that we need to study how the microbiome may be predisposing someone to get worse versus better disease outcomes in the face of COVID-19.
It's so important when we talk about this to recognize that not a lot of this or any of this research around COVID-19 has been peer reviewed because, as you mentioned, it's happening so fast. And so this is a tough question, and I'll leave it to both of you to try and answer this. But you said that the predisposition of some people who have a certain type of microbiome to have a more negative response to COVID. Are there any postulations or hypotheses that has been shared among the scientific community about that, and what we can try and think about? How do you characterize that in terms of what that microbiome differentiation is? Either one of you that feels comfortable kind of talking about that.
well, you want to go? Well, I guess I think one of the big problems with COVID is you get this massive inflammatory response, the cytokine storm, as Claire called it, and we know that microbes really do influence the immune responses. And when you're thinking about the diseases I mentioned, such as obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, you have microbes that are more inflammatory. And that's part of why you get these diseases. And so it's thought that you have these microbes causing all this inflammation already in this disease, and you get COVID, having those microbes there makes you more inflammatory, which then causes problems in terms of the actual COVID disease.
If I put that in layman's terms, is it that your inflammatory system is sort of on a hair trigger response and it overreacts if your microbiome is not properly in check?
Yeah, I think that's one way of putting it, that the immune system is good for fighting infections, but if you get too much of a good thing, it causes a lot of problems. And that's what you're seeing with COVID, that all the inflammation in the lungs causes the lung tissue damage, for example, is the body over-responding. And people that have these inflammatory microbes tend to over-respond more. That's probably about the best reason I've seen circulating around there about the microbes affecting COVID. Claire, you want to add something?
Yes, the only thing I would add is that this may be one of the important components that are being studied by a number of people now, many of whom study the microbiome, but there's also genetic reasons that will make certain people predisposed to react more strongly to microbes, for example. So I think at the end, it will be like a multifactorial situation. In some cases, it'll be genetics, and some it may be the microbiome or a combination of both.
So that leads pretty well into this question of vulnerability. Who's more vulnerable to getting it and the comorbidities associated with the disease? Can you talk a little bit about how, when we were doing the documentary, it was so interesting for me to learn about the rise in asthma, allergies, all of these things that are associated with sort of a damaged microbiome or different, less diverse microbiome, and how they impact other diseases. And so can you guys talk a little bit about those comorbidities and how those are perhaps, and we're still in early days of understanding how those are impacted by the microbiome?
Sure. To me, it became really interesting from the get-go to hear that it is those that are obese and that have hypertension and other metabolic diseases that seem to have the highest risk to develop severe COVID and to die from it. Because we now know with really strong evidence that changes to the microbiome, what we know as dysbiosis, this imbalance of your microbiome, contribute very strongly to those diseases. And this has been quite a shift to the medical background in general, because these are diseases where even 10 years ago, microbes didn't really have a role. If you look at, medical books, and if you study how diabetes or how obesity comes to happen, microbes didn't used to have a role in it, and now we understand that they do. So what we're seeing are parallels for COVID, for example, of these comorbidities that will make someone more akin to get severe disease and die from it, and then the conditions themselves that are associated with an altered microbiome. Again, the pieces of the puzzle have not been put together yet, and it'll be some time until they do. But I do strongly believe that there's a biological connection that we just need to characterize.
So maybe I could jump in there. So as you know, Becky, I wrote a book about aging as well in the microbes. It's called The Whole Body Microbiome. And the biggest risk factor for COVID is age. There's no doubt, and especially for mortality. And we know as you get older, your microbes, just like when you have obesity and these other diseases, your microbes become dysbiotic, they become imbalanced. And there's a lot of thought that perhaps as these older people are aging, their microbes are changing. Again, they're more inflammatory, that this may also be contributing to the age effect we see, which is the biggest risk factor for COVID, period.
When Claire was talking about metabolic diseases, and also we've talked about autoimmune diseases and how they are impacted by the microbiome, and therefore make you more vulnerable to either getting COVID or having a negative response. Can you go back and just sort of break it down to talk about how the microbiome creates these metabolic diseases and these autoimmune diseases?
Sure. So we're born without any microbes, and of course we're born very immature. We have to undergo many phases of development, and we also have to do this while we're getting colonized or bombarded with microbes. What we now understand is that these microbes have a very important role in how we develop, and whether this development is going to follow a trajectory to health or to the lack of health. And there's now a very important piece of evidence showing that for the diseases that we're talking about, for metabolic diseases like diabetes or obesity, as well as for other immune diseases like asthma and allergies, changes to these microbes are going to create signals that are going to put us into this trajectory of lack of health, or they're going to put us into this disease trajectory. And this trajectory seems to be better defined early or earlier in life. So early in life, our immune system, our metabolism, and now we also understand our neurological systems, they rely not only on our genes, but they rely on the genes of our microbes that are part of our body. And if these microbes are not healthy or not the best ones that we could have, we could make those diseases more likely to appear.
Brett, how do you think that scientists should target their research around COVID to include the microbiome and its importance going forward here?
Well, I think being Microbiome Day, I think it's a great question because many scientists are doing just that. I'm involved in several studies where actually us and many others around the world are just looking at what is the microbiome doing during COVID? What was it like before and after they have COVID? Does COVID actually change their microbiome? And they're also looking at not just the microbiome in the gut, there's the microbiome in the lungs and on the skin and things. So I think that's one thing we've learned in the last decade is that pretty much whatever disease you study, you now have to have a microbiome aspect to it because many of these things do have a play in it. So I think there's lots of interesting studies now going on that how microbiome changed due to COVID and our world changed. I mean, we think of how many people you interacted with before and after early March when we got shut down. How many plane rides people were going on versus then versus now. How many times you go to the grocery store, how many times you go to the playground. These are all normal interactions that we as social creatures normally have. And we stopped all that. We stopped it cold. And we know that in animal studies and things, if you do that, you change your microbes and you suddenly aren't exposed to microbes. And just to give another example, what happens if you gave birth in the last 3 months? How is that child, what kind of environment is that child being raised in compared to, a year ago in terms of microbial exposure? And so these are all the really interesting questions that people are now starting to look at. And there is some concern that, yes, at least in Canada, we've been able to sort of control COVID a lot more, but it may have another price in terms of our microbiome. And we need to follow how those changes affect us in the future. And, these kids are being born during COVID. They may have different microbes that may have effect on some of the diseases that Claire and I have been talking about, asthma, obesity, et cetera. And we just don't know. So those are some of the many questions that microbiologists and other people, anthropologists, et cetera, are all looking at as we study this. I consider it just the world's greatest experiment. We have, 10 million data points already. It's just incredible from a scientific perspective. I mean, it's horrible, obviously, but it's a real changed world. And so we can study how the microbes are working in this changed world.
I want to get into that issue of newborns and kids and parents. But as we've been talking about the risk factors with this disease and how it impacts how the microbiome could play into that, is there anything that we as lay people can do for our health in this moment? I'm like the microbiome cheerleader in my friend group, and they're all always asking me like, so what, do I eat more kimchi? Like what do I do about it? So is there anything in the moment that people should know and do differently?
Go ahead,
Sure.
Claire.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that both in our book and in this film, we argue that, of course, social exposures, like Brett was saying, are really important, but there's many things that we can do to nourish this microbiome. And the biggest one to me continues to be diet. And this is at all ages. We're talking about babies, right? But throughout our ages, there's foods that are well known to nourish the right kind of microbes. Fiber is an incredibly important component, and fiber comes in foods that we take at all ages. So we think about a baby. Breast milk is fascinating. It has really specific fibers that will nourish microbes. They're actually natural prebiotics, if you may. So if you're having a baby right now, like we say in the book, do everything that you can to try and breastfeed and exclusively breastfeed this baby. And then the same thing goes along with babies that become a little bit older and start eating solid foods, make vegetables and fruits and high fiber carbohydrates part of their everyday staples. And now more than ever, because we're missing out this social connection, I think diet is a key way of maintaining this microbiome.
When you spoke in the documentary and talked about how you spoke with your kids about this issue and differentiating between prebiotics and probiotics, we have the microbiome in us. And what you said to your kids is there's a zoo in you.
That's right.
And that you have to feed the animals in the zoo. And so the fiber you're talking about, the green leafy vegetables, the things that are actually hard to digest and make it all the way to the end of your intestinal tract, those are the foods for the zoo in you and the animals, and you have to feed them. And I think that was such a good way. I think about it every time I put leafy greens or fiber rich vegetables, beans, food on the table for my kids and for myself, that you're doing something for this zoo, and the zoo is keeping us healthy, right?
Yeah, exactly. And every time my kids come back and say, but we don't like it, you can say, well, it's not for you. It doesn't matter if you don't like it. It's not really for you. You're not eating it, right? There's trillions of microbes that you are hosting that need to eat that. So diet is super important. Brett was saying that he's eating a ton of bread. I have also jumped the bread baking and bread making bandwagon. Sourdough, though, this is something we jumped into the sourdough bandwagon. I didn't used to have a mother starter. Now I do, and I've been doing a ton of research of how different carbohydrates are ingested and assimilated when they go a longer fermentation process. So there's a lot that can be said about the gut health benefits of eating more fermented foods. I would say this is a good time to do that.
Brett, what do we know about eating probiotics like sauerkraut, kimchi, sourdough bread, all of these things? What do we know about how those actually take root and colonize? Do they?
Well, we know they're made by microbes. There's microbes in there if it's fermented food. The scientific literature is not all that strong yet in what they actually do. They can't hurt. And, and in terms of probiotics, there are some probiotics that have been shown to work for some things, but I think we're a long ways off from understanding the perfect bug for the perfect thing all the time. But I think, as Claire said, diet is, through these natural type foods that contain microbes. That's another way of getting microbial exposure, the fermented foods. I guess in addition, I'd like to add a last question that we have completely sanitized our world. Think of how we behave now. We wash our hands, goodness knows how many times a day. We wear a mask. We don't touch anyone. I can't remember the last time I hugged anyone other than my wife, for example. You can't do that anymore. And so that, ironically, is how we used to behave, 100 years ago when infectious diseases were a major problem. And we got into a nice, safe world. We had our vaccines, and the diseases that we saw 100 years ago, we didn't see too many of now. So we've got this really cleaned up, hygienic world that we've suddenly redone to ourselves. And that's where I really do worry about. And I think, diet is certainly a way of being exposed, assuming you had the bugs in the first place, you can enrich for them. But also think about what you're doing to your microbes in general. And there are other ways of getting exposure besides diet. Even just going outside and, COVID is not in the dirt unless someone has just sneezed on it 5 minutes ago, kind of thing. And think about repopulating your microbes too, as well as nourishing them with the diet, I think is another thing we need to think about, because we have gone to a hyper sanitized world right now. And that is going to hurt our microbes, I think, in the long run. So think about how you can repair them.
Playgrounds are basically taped off and kids can't even touch the slides and what have you. And the premise of the book and our documentary is let them eat dirt, meaning that as they're playing and they're in the dirt and they're exposed to other people, they are getting healthier. And I think, it helps to understand the problem with this hyper-sanitized world when we look at the lack of diversity in the present day microbiome compared to the historical microbiome. And I was on microbiomeday.com today, and it's about celebrating diversity. What a great tie-in to everything that's going on in the world. But diversity of the microbiome protects us, right, Claire?
That's right. And ecologists have known this for the longest time. The microbiome is not an exception, it's an ecosystem. And the more diversity an ecosystem have, the better functioning it will have. And there's several reasons for that may not be that important for this, but yeah, the diversity is key for our microbiome health. And diversity is set up really early in life. It'll be really hard to have a really diverse microbiome later in life. We don't have the science to accomplish that, but early in life seems to be the time to welcome more types of microbes to take hold in your gut and other areas of your body too.
So what can we be doing right now to not hyper sanitize? I'm trying to save my hand sanitizer, alcohol, Clorox for when I know that I've been in a high exposure environment. Also, I would add that since we first started learning about COVID-19, that for work, I talked to quite a few immunologists and infectious disease specialists, and the advice has changed, where in the beginning, the sanitizing surfaces was as important, if not more so, than a lot of the talk about respiratory inhalation. And now it feels like things are less focused on that surface transmission And that might actually help us to calm down the hypersanitization. Do you see that, Brett?
Yeah, it's been really interesting how it's evolved. I've never understood what the surface thing was about because this is a droplet-borne thing. So when you sneeze, you cough, you breathe, you talk, you push out these droplets, and they go about 6 feet, 2 meters, and they kind of fall down. And yes, they go on a surface, but what happens with water on a surface? It dries up, right? And as soon as it gets dry, the virus dies. So really, it's a droplet-borne type thing. And other things you can do, I mean, you don't need to wear a mask in your home unless there's someone with COVID there. You don't need to hand sanitize in your own home. As you say, you sort of gear up when you're going out to exposure where there might be higher risk situations. Um, you don't need to wear a mask if you're the only person on a football field, for example. I mean, only if you're within 3 feet or playing tackle football or something, you know. So, close. So you have to be rational about it. I also worry that we're freaked out too much in a sense about this. And you have to try and think, why are we doing this? Why am I wearing a mask? Well, because if you or I are making these droplets, well, they don't travel miles and miles, you know. So within reason there, I see people with masks on inside their car. And I'm trying to figure that one out, right? Because where is the COVID in the car?
If you
Unless so, you know, so I think you need to put a bit of common sense to it all. The other question I get a lot is, what about my food? Do I have to sanitize all my groceries and everything? And so COVID is not a gastrointestinal bug. It's inhaled into the lungs where it binds to this receptor called the ACE2 receptor and then enters the body there. It doesn't enter in the gut. So the other thing in your gut is, the food goes through this acid wash in your stomach, which is thought to really kill these things. So these people that come in and they wipe down with Purell all their groceries and everything, you don't need to do that. It's not a gastrointestinal bug. You can sometimes find it in the feces, but there's still argument whether that's even infectious or not. And so I think try and put the common sense of why are we doing all these things, the social distancing, the mask, the hand washing, that's all hygiene transmission. And if that transmission is not likely to occur, you don't need it. If it's likely to occur, for sure, use it, because wearing masks does work. Social distancing does work. Hand washing does work, type things.
Claire, is there anything that you do that you, as a microbiologist and as a scientist, that seems like it goes against what other people are doing in these COVID times, and that it comes from a place of having a recognition of the science? I think it's been really helpful to talk to scientists to understand how they're just going through their everyday lives and the things they worry about and the things they don't worry about.
Sure. I would say yes. Echoing what Brett is saying, the recognition that this is a disease that travels with humans. So there you have it. If you understand the human as potential routes of infection, you just need to allow that to define how you're going to protect yourself. And of course, that situation is going to be very different if you live in New York City or in LA or in a highly populated environment where there's going to be a lot of humans that are the transmitter of the disease. And then, yeah, maybe even in those cases, surfaces may be an issue where you just have too many people and too many infected people. I would say that for me, like what you were alluding to, I wear a mask wherever I have to encounter other people. I clean myself with sanitizer before and after I encounter other people. And I do the same thing with my children. So this understanding that I'm not going to get the disease just from the air, is not spontaneously going to generate there. That guides that type of measures that I take, and how I keep myself clean and hopefully disease free.
From our chat on Facebook Live, a question about pets as a source of transmission. Any thoughts?
Well, there are studies to indicate that dogs may transmit it. The numbers are not great. Like, the problem with COVID, everything is so new that we can't say definitively. I would, as Claire said, this is probably a human pathogen. It probably jumped from some other species into humans, but it doesn't make dogs sick. It doesn't make cats sick. It's unlikely that's a natural vector. So I would think it's probably very little risk coming from them, other than potentially if you sneeze on their fur and you have COVID, and then your kid then licks that fur right immediately, potentially that way. I think there's bigger things you got to worry about than your pet, especially your pets in your house, and your house is clean. I don't think your pet is going to run to the playground to pick up COVID and bring it home, but the data is just not there.
So the specific advice is don't lick the dog.
Lick your own dog, not someone else's.
Let's talk about parents and pediatricians and best practices here because, it really has a kind of an interesting aspect of one, we've got newborns who, as you guys said, the advice for newborns now more than ever is try as hard as you can for a vaginal birth, try as hard as you can to breastfeed, expose them to the family pet. We know that dogs bring dirt into the house, and that's good for babies and kids. Any other specific advice for the newborn age group? And then I'll move us a little older to toddlers and school age kids. Anything else there?
I would say now more than ever, it's always been key, but now more than ever, keep vaccination schedules on time. That is critical. You don't want your kid to develop an infection that it's preventable right now, taking that child, especially if it's a newborn, to the hospital. And that includes, of course, the influenza vaccine. This is really not the time to develop a respiratory disease that then a medical team has to diagnose in the face of COVID, right? So vaccination is key right now.
I say, what kind of parent are you if you don't yell at least 5 times a day at your kids, stop doing that on the skateboard, we're not going to the ER.
That's right.
So vaccinations is a continuation of number one, that idea that you don't want to need to expose yourself to a medical situation because it's
and then
virus.
your kid develops something, you don't know what it is, it has a fever, that means that you have to self-isolate completely because of that. So this is the time to do whatever you can to remain healthy.
And secondarily, if your child develops some sort of an infection where they need antibiotics, we're trying to avoid antibiotics as much as possible to keep the microbiome healthy. Brett, can you talk a little bit about that for parents?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting area of research right now. So when COVID came along, antibiotic use went up hugely for a bunch of different reasons. And one thing is they're just trying anything to see if it would work. Now, as you know, antibiotics don't affect viruses, they usually affect bacteria. So the idea is to avoid secondary bacterial infections. They're not going to cure COVID by themselves. But also, when you take antibiotics, you wipe out many of your microbes. And we actually say you're carpet bombing your microbes. You're getting rid of all these things. And so they can be detrimental. And then you can actually hurt your microbiome, which then has consequences. We just had a really nice paper showing that antibiotic use in the first year basically really increases asthma rates. If you decrease antibiotic use, you decrease asthma 5 years later. So, antibiotics are a two-edged sword. If you need them, if it's a life-threatening bacterial disease, absolutely. These are wonder drugs. If you have a fever or maybe ear infections that probably viral, probably not. And this holds now as it did pre-COVID. So antibiotics should be used judiciously. The other reason you don't want to use a ton of antibiotics all the time is you also trigger antibiotic resistance. And when these microbes become resistant, then the antibiotics don't work anymore. We're seeing more and more of this as we use more antibiotics. And really, I honestly believe that if we didn't have COVID, I think the antimicrobial resistance would be the next big train wreck in our world, where infections that you could previously treat with antibiotics, you could no longer treat. And this is going to be a major problem. So use them wisely, but use them if needed. If they don't need them, don't use them.
Let's move up into a little bit of an older age group for kids. I was researching the other day, and the stats right now are that 1.7% of all the cases of COVID that have been diagnosed in the US are with children. And that's a very small number compared to the total number. And it really speaks to what you were referring to, Brett, about age being the huge factor here. And so it talks a little bit about, what do you assess as the risk as we think about kids restarting school, about opening the economy and the importance of childcare and preschool centers to reopen? How do you assess the risk? One infectious disease doc I talked to, he's still kind of nervous about sending his 5-year-old back to school. How do you two see that risk assessment?
It's a complicated risk assessment. There's too many factors, many of which are not even related to the infectious risk itself, right? But social and economic ones. And kids could not be kept completely outside of school for a long time for many reasons. So I wouldn't want to be those decisions makers right now. And you're right. So kids are a lot less likely to develop disease, but there's studies showing that they do carry the disease and they are excellent at being asymptomatic. There's pretty good peer-reviewed science now showing that they can transmit the disease because they carry high loads of viruses in their their nasal tracts and also in their guts. So it's a tricky situation. Do you keep them home to avoid them, both for the minority of them getting infected, but propagating the disease? There are data coming out of France, for example, and out of Quebec as well, of some outbreaks, of course, happening when kids were allowed to be back in school. At the same time, people need to go to work, society needs to start functioning at some level, and there's a lot of reliance on the school system for that to happen. From my perspective, eventually children are going to have to go back to school, and what's going to drive that is going to be site specific, depending on how the infection rates are going in a specific place, but it's not going to be a one or an only decision. Like with the disease, there will be waves of decision. If the infection goes up, then we may be asked to look after our children and teach our children again. But I do hope that in September, there will be some form of formal education happening.
Yeah, it really is a question of privilege in a lot of ways, because a lot of folks have not even stopped. Essential workers have never stopped sending their kids to daycare. So acknowledging that is important. And as you say, the economy is going to have to restart. Kids can't be kept inside all of the time. And as we think about kids in these summer months, you know, we're balancing so many different competing risks, I guess you would say. So, you know, for me, I'm deeply concerned about kids and screens. So I'm trying to keep my kids off screens. But then again, they can't go have a million play dates. So then I have to keep them busy, but I am working. And we had a question from someone in our Facebook group. Let me read this. This is another thing. Claudia says, I send my kids outside to play and I worry about the metals in the dirt because it's an older house that's been remodeled, lead. You know, how do we balance all of these competing parental paranoias and risks? Where do we sit in this? And Brett, as a microbiologist, how do you place this for parents?
Welcome to parenthood. It ain't easy, and those of us who've gone through it will certainly vouch for that. I mean, even pre-COVID, your heads were spinning about what to do as a parent. I guess my best advice would be to put it into perspective. If they're going outside, great. If they're playing with 20 other neighborhood kids and there's high levels of COVID, not so great. We shouldn't do that. I think the biggest point that Claire made is the kids probably won't get sick, but they do carry this virus, and they come home and parents are no longer kids, and they see the grandparents. They're at a bigger risk. So the kid might not get sick, but you could infect a grandparent that's in an elder care home, and then it just tears through the home and all those horrible things. So put things in perspective. I think one of the biggest issues with schools is school teachers. So they're not kids. The kids are probably okay, but what about the poor teacher standing in front of these 20 kids who potentially might be a carrier not showing symptoms? So there's big issues there. Do they have to stand behind a plexiglass screen? I think, I think many places put school in place for a month in June, sort of partially, and that was kind of an experiment to see what works and what doesn't. And I think we learned a lot from that experiment, and they have time over the summer to then implement that in September when the kids go back. Claire's right, kids need socialization. All studies show that just keeping a kid in a vacuum is the worst thing you can do for their social development. So we're gonna have to figure something out. But it is scary times. But I think that I mean, we're still seeing other people. It's not that I haven't seen anyone. I just can't be close contact. But we have visitors, and I played a jazz group, and so we play outside, and we're 10 feet apart from each other, in the backyard. But we're still playing. So I think you have to try and adapt to this new world as best you can. You can't say let's just go back to normal. Oh, don't worry. And until we get a vaccine. And even we get a vaccine, I'm not sure we'll ever go back to pre-COVID in terms of how we behave. There's no doubt our behavior is being changed. So, there's too many things in the world to worry about, I think. So I think you just kind of got to prioritize and say, okay, what is the risk that my kid go outside? They're probably the bigger risk of getting hit by a car if they're playing by themselves than they are of playing with a sibling, for example. So again, balance and and parenting ain't easy.
I call it COVID calculus, when you have to rethink something so basic that you never thought about before. And now you need to bring in all these algorithmic assessments of whether it's risky, are you doing the right thing? Is it socially acceptable? I mean, going to Costco, I come home and just need a nap. So, Claire, you're a mom. What do you think about some of these competing issues as we're trying to assess our children's mental health, physical health, and all the things that go into that?
For sure. I mean, one of the things that has really surprised me, I think I really underestimated our children's ability to cope and to develop new habits. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to ask them to stay physically distant when they're playing or meeting someone. How are they going to even be able to do that? And then lo and behold, they actually learn to do that. So I think that from any perspective, my children continue to teach me that, yeah, they're going to be okay mentally, even potentially more resilient from an experience like this, where they will learn that they have to wash their hands when they come in from the outside. And they will learn that there will be one person as much as possible doing the shopping, and they're not going to be involved with that, and that they have to stay distant from other people. And it has been it's been quite the experience for me to see it unfold and see that they can just learn. They're like us, they're just creatures of habit, and they are developing habits. Some of them do worry me, of course, as someone has that writes and studies the microbiome. I do worry about how hygienic they have become. And I do hope that a few years from now, we will revert and we will not have to be carrying gel sanitizer with us. But I do worry about those habit forming measures that kids may be even better than us to just take and continue with them.
Well, let's take that as a jumping off point to talk about the next wave. So when we move through some of these initial stages of transmission rates being high and shelter in place, and we go into a recovery mode, whenever that may be, are you too concerned that the effects of this hyper sanitized, over hygienic world, the habits that we're forming right now, the newborns that were raised without exposure to a diverse microbiome, are going to have a follow-on effect? Are we going to see higher rates of asthma and allergy and diabetes and metabolic disease? What do you see as the next phase and the long term, Brett? Where are we going?
Well, I think I like to say that we're sort of, up until COVID, we're suffering from this hygiene hangover. We went for, oh my God, I'm going to die of infectious disease no matter what type. 100 years ago, we eased off. We got polio vaccine. There's no longer smallpox, and we got antibiotics. So we actually eased off. COVID has set us back, many years, many decades, probably in that sense. And what we know is that we went along that path and we got cleaner and cleaner. We actually did harm our microbes. So yes, I think there'll be some setback here. I think if there is a vaccine out in the next 2 or 3 years, I think that we will recover pretty quickly. Knowing human nature, my guess is the airplanes will be full the next day. People will be getting back out there, which I'm hoping we'll learn some other things too that COVID has taught us. But I think long term, I think there's no doubt many of us will be tracking these newborns during the COVID age and what are their rates. But the other thing is we've learned a lot, and as we've talked about, there are ways of repairing these microbiomes through diet and probiotics and exposure and things. So I'm hoping that will counter a lot of the detrimental effects. But the other thing is that I think that we will, there will be more pandemics. I mean, it always amazes me that this took a century to hit us. When things, I've studied infectious disease all my life. When things about flu and things, when SARS hit, I thought, okay, this is it. luckily didn't hit. So this is just human nature. I mean, microbes always change and they find a new place. And when you've got, 10 billion warm-blooded, 37-degree people that feed you every day, it's a perfect thing. If you can figure out how to crawl into that and then transmit between them, it's microbial heyday, right? They're just organisms living. And so the world we live in, we've developed it such that we happily travel, we happily embrace complete strangers all the time. And COVID's made us rethink this a bit. And so I think there's lessons learned about humans. Early humans lived in small groups, tribes kind of thing, 15, 20 people. So you couldn't have a pandemic back then. You had other diseases, but things couldn't sweep across the world. Then when we started living in cities, had shipping routes and things, that's when we started to see things like plague and these other pandemics start to race around the world. So I think we've learned a lot in COVID, and we dusted off what we learned in SARS. And I think we do need to live in this changed world for a while. And my guess is even if it does end, some of our habits will change. I think we'll be more cautious about our interactions with various other people, and it'll be a changed world.
Claire, in the book and in the documentary, we talked about repairing the microbiome in extreme ways. We talked about things like fecal transplants for people who have severe gastrointestinal problems with their microbiome. And we know the science is evolving on that. Do you think that COVID-19 and this hypersanitization will lead to sort of microbial rehabilitation treatments? Like we'll go to the spa for our microbes?
That's a great question. I don't know if COVID will be what leads to that. I think that there's already research trying to explore different ways of remediating our microbiome. To me, the answer really, Becky, is we don't know. We really do not know how much, if any, our microbiomes will change. There's other aspects, if you want to call it positive, about being in lockdown. I mean, my kids haven't had a cold in 4 months. For my kids, it doesn't really matter because they're older, but for newborns, we do know that if you have many respiratory diseases, you will have a higher chance of developing asthma, for example. So it can go either way. We really do not know. We know because this is, like Brett was saying, a massive human experiment happening right now. We do know that it's worth studying it because we do expect changes, but it'll be really hard for me to say, we do expect an increase in non-communicable diseases or in immune-mediated diseases because of COVID and the microbiome. We don't know. We just really need to study it and monitor it, especially for children.
As we start to just wrap up this conversation, I just wanted to give both of you the opportunity. I'll start with you, Brett. Is there anything that you think is really important that people know right now in this moment about the microbiome that we didn't touch on today?
I think we've hit on the main highlights. I think one good thing about COVID is people suddenly woke up to microbiology. I think everyone now knows a little bit there's this thing called a virus, and holy smokes, these things could do things to our world. I mean, so from a microbe point of view, that's been very interesting. And I think it's been a really interesting experiment in human behavior and social changes. And as Claire said, humans are amazing and resilient. I mean, it's amazing how we've actually adopted in a very short time to this changed world when previously I didn't think we could do that actually that quickly. Within 2 days we had suddenly shifted, and that was quite something. So I guess my pitch would be to put things in perspective and common sense. I mean, okay, you've got a virus, it's transmitted from person to person using droplets. So we know how to prevent that. I've often wondered, well, maybe the entire world should stock up and we should just shut the entire world down for a month. There would be no more COVID, but that's not human nature. So just use common sense. And ironically, this is just natural. This is just biology in action. We're just caught in the middle of it affecting us. I mean, pandemics happen all the time, and many other species, we just don't see them because they're not happening to us. This is just nature being nature. And we as humans have to figure out how to live within that and respect it and know how to deal with it.
Helpful thoughts. Claire?
I would say to continue, for those that have been following the microbiome and microbiome science, to continue minding your microbes. And for those, like Brett was saying, that woke up to, oh, what is microbiology? What is a microbe? To continue learning from it. I mean, the background that I chose today, it's almost an analogy to, we live in a microbial world. We are at their mercy. And right now we may be going through a phase where that mercy is more negative than not, and we have to completely change the way we live because of it. But in the great scheme of things, microbes are incredibly positive and important to our lives. So keep that message and that idea balanced, keep ourselves informed, and keep reading about microbes, both good and bad aspects of it.
It always comforts me to talk to scientists. As a lay person, it's comforting, because I think there's a perception of this as following a natural path, and that there are things we can do to make logical choices and assess risk. So I just want to thank both of you. Claire Arrieta is assistant professor at the Cummings School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. Brett Finlay is a professor of microbiology and biochemistry at the Michael Smith Labs at the University of British Columbia. They are co-authors of the book, Let Them Eat Dirt. And that is the name of the documentary that the three of us and an amazing team of producers and folks working behind the scenes are bringing to you later this year. So as Claire said, mind your microbes. And one of the ways you can do that is to like this Facebook page and follow along as we share news and information related to the microbiome, especially in light of the current pandemic that we're living through. So thank you both for this conversation, and thank all of you who are watching. I'm Becky Worley. Take care.